All right, happy St. Patrick's Day Eve to everyone. Thank you for coming. Let's all take a deep breath and let's open with prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you today for this transition of weather from summer to winter and hopefully back again soon to spring. We are grateful for those people who have joined us today, and we ask for your blessing on them. We ask for your blessing on the United States while it undergoes transitions. Keep us strong and healthy and help us find unity. Amen. I should have introduced myself. My name is Jan Feldman, and I am part of the Adult Education Committee. And I don't really think that Matt Helms needs an introduction, but here he is. He is the Associate Pastor for Children, Family, and Welcoming Ministries. He's been here for 15 years. Coming up on 15 years. Yay. It's very exciting. So this is the second of 3 weeks in comparing the Gospels. So the class does conclude next week, and you won't want to miss it. Just in terms of upcoming classes, we have some really exciting ones. On March 30th here in Borwell at 11 o'clock, we have the Classics of Lenten Music, and it's taught by Oliver Camacho, who's the producer and host of the Opera Box Office Score podcast and the musical director of classical WFMT radio stations. So that is going to be excellent. You'll want to mark your calendars for that. And then a really exciting new opportunity on April 6th, Sean Fiedler, who's our major gift officer here at the church, will join the owners of Mangle Florist and the Venerable Drake Hotel, Will Nifong and Colin Collette, who are owners of that store, and they're going to talk about flowers and liturgy. Then we're going to break for 2 weeks, Palm Sunday and Easter, and come roaring back on April 27th with something you will not want to miss called Holy Hip Hop. And it's going to be led by Kevin Koval, the senior advisor to Ibu Patel, who runs Interfaith America. So those are the classes through the end of April. There are some classes in May that are already scheduled, and they're on the Fourth Presbyterian Church website under Adult Education. So without further ado, let's clap for Matt Helms.
All right. Excellent. Thank you all. It's great to be back with you and certainly recognize a lot of familiar faces from the last class. But just so you know, as we get in, going to kind of do some stage setting, we are going to be spending a great deal of time in Mark and Matthew's Gospels today, which if you're looking, I promise we're not going to go way deep in the weeds on this. There's a lot of text on your handout, but we're going to be covering everything that you need to know. So one of the things that we were discussing last time is as we talked about the Gospels and how we do some of this comparing work, one of the key sort of foundational vocab words that you might want to know is this synoptics, this understanding of Matthew, Luke, and Mark all playing off of one another, and that a lot of comparative gospel work comes from setting these texts side by side and looking both at similarities as well as differences. And so you'll hear that term synoptics come up a handful of times. We discussed last time, and if you want, you're always welcome to go back or read a bunch of books that are arguing the details, but most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark was the first one to be written. We'll get into a little bit of the reasons why today, but that is sort of one of the bases that we're going to be going off of as we do some of this comparison work. And then finally, this last one, this understanding of how they're all interacting with one another is crucial. That essentially is the foundation for all of this. So as a reminder, this chart, you don't need to know all these numbers in detail, but if you just see that purple in the center, this triple tradition, that there is a great deal that is shared amongst all of those. And in particular, you see the Gospel of Mark, which we are about to be covering. The bulk of the Gospel of Mark you will find reflected in both Luke and Matthew. But as we'll see, there's some significant additions in both Luke and Matthew's text. But for this opening, and I know I'm kind of racing through at the start, I want to make sure to preserve enough time to get deep into these texts. We're going to be starting with the one that scholars presume was the first one written, that Gospel of Mark. And particularly Mark's depiction of Jesus as the suffering Messiah. And that is an important part of what Mark is trying to do in his gospel. Now, again, a little review from last time. The Gospel of Mark may or may not have been written by a traveling companion of Paul named John Mark. The historical record is incredibly blurry and complicated on this. But there is a John Mark that is referenced in the book of Acts, both chapter 12 and 15. So there may have been some degree of being an eyewitness or travel there. Ancient church fathers also state that Mark's gospel is derived from sermons given by Peter, which is really interesting when we get into some of the text today. I don't know if Peter was very self-deprecating or what's going on there, but there's a little bit of a clash going on with that information. And finally, this understanding that it may have been written in Rome. That seems to be some of the earliest attestations. But more than likely, what we can say, I don't want to say for sure, but a good likelihood is that it was written right around the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, so in 70 AD. So sometime within a 5-year gap of that time period seems to have been when the Gospel of Mark was fully compiled and put together, although almost certainly there are sources that date well before 70 as part of it. But let's get into Mark and some of what makes it unique amongst all the gospel texts. So to start, take a look if you have a handout, and we're doing a side-by-side look. This actually worked out very well that Tom's sermon today was on this opening of Mark as well, so a great little bit of coherence. Look at Mark's text versus Matthew's when you combine these similar passages. Starkly different at how quick Mark is moving. Now, this isn't the case for every passage, but fairly consistently, you will see Mark in a sentence or two what Matthew and Luke will do in paragraphs. And one of the interesting things behind this, and part of what has led scholars to believe that Mark was written first, is that it doesn't make sense for Mark to have been reading Matthew's text and be like, well, that all sounds great, but I'm just going to cross it off and move on. Almost certainly you're going to be adding on to text rather than taking it away. And so you see this incredibly swift pace starting right from the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, and that continues through much of it. You'll also notice, and anytime you're reading through Mark, one of the unique little quirks about it is this frequent use of this word euthys, which means immediately. Mark loves this word. It appears 41 times throughout the Gospel of Mark. And if you look at the other Gospels combined, it only uses that word 9 times, most of them quoting from Mark. I've sometimes described this as, it seems as though Jesus is power walking around Galilee with the pace of his ministry. Mark has him doing everything immediately, and there's very little break in all of this. Now, you'll also see that Mark itself is significantly shorter than the other Gospels as well, thousands of words shorter. And so because of that, one of the primary things to know is just that this likely was the earliest text. This was the basis on which the other Gospel writers were jumping off from. But that's not to say that Mark doesn't have incredible value, and part of what we're going to be getting into is what Mark was trying to do with his Gospel text. Now, part of what makes it unique is because it was the first one written and it's not responding to the others, everything that the Gospel of Mark has to say would have been unique at that time. But there are some critical things going on that I think are important to highlight as we look at the Gospel as a whole and still stand out even compared to others within the Gospels. So one of the most unique features that you'll see in Mark is there's this persistent theme of misunderstanding that is going on. The religious leaders of Jesus' day are constantly misunderstanding what Jesus is doing. You have this series almost right off the bat in Mark, the second chapter and the little bit into the third is centered around these 5 conflicts over different relationships with Torah law. And so Jesus is sort of reinterpreting them to some degree. You have later clashes with the Pharisees. Certainly, you have clashes as Jesus enters into Jerusalem and the overturning of the temple. And so there's this consistent theme within Mark of misunderstanding with religious leaders. But that's not unique. You see that obviously in the other Gospels as well. What makes Mark really unique is that it's not only the religious leaders, it's the disciples who always are having a hard time understanding who exactly Jesus is. I've sometimes described it as the disciples seem to be batting below the Mendoza line, for those of you who are baseball fans. They just keep swinging and missing. And you see that pop up over and over in the text. It's fascinating. You see Jesus asking this question, do you not understand? Later on, can you see anything? There's this tension that is running throughout the course of the gospel in which these disciples seem to be having a hard time figuring out what Jesus is meaning by his words. So if you flip to the second page of your handout, you'll see one instance of this, and where I believe I have a slide that lays these side by side. So this is just one example from about the middle of the gospel. Jesus is talking to them. They're traveling on the road, and he has a little criticism for them. They are worried that he is giving a reference, speaking about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and he talks to them about, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? It keeps going on. He's not exactly taking it easy on them. But interestingly, this scene concludes by saying, do you not understand? Now take for a moment and let's read both in Matthew and Luke's accounts, presuming, I think rightly, that they are adapting this. Look at that last verse. Then they understood that he had not told them to beware in Matthew. They understood. Doesn't understand in Mark's. Luke, nothing that is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing is secret that will not become known. Again, this sort of opaque statement of we will understand. Both Matthew and Luke, over and over, are almost sort of tweaking Mark to say, no, the disciples do understand what's going on. So how do we account for this tension within Mark? It's fascinating. One of the things that I think we can assume about Mark is that this is capturing some of the tension that those earliest disciples were feeling. This genuine misunderstanding on their part about Jesus's purpose. And later gospel writers, particularly those who may have had, direct connection to disciples, may have felt like that was a little bit, whether it's opaque or a little bit overstated about how much they misunderstood. Yet I've always really loved putting myself into the position of the disciples. Surely Jesus, that shift that he is making in his ministry would have been incredibly mind-bending, eye-opening to them. I think there is a lot of truth to this theme of misunderstanding, even if later gospel writers wanted to adjust that a little bit. Now, one of the main misunderstandings, and really what is at the core of the Gospel of Mark, is on this misunderstanding of what Jesus' suffering and death means and his role as Messiah. And that is one of the key pieces that Mark is trying to do in his text. If you're going to find a passage that I think really crystallizes the entirety of the Gospel of Mark, it would be this one from Mark chapter 8, verses 29 through 33. And I think it's worth reading through it, and you have it in your handout as well, with the bolded parts, I would say are pretty important. So this is a climactic moment in the Gospel. Jesus asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you are the Messiah. And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. We're going to come back to that. And then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all of this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Again, misunderstanding. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Nothing summarizes the Gospel of Mark more than this passage, because what Mark is trying to do, particularly in the second half of the Gospel, is reframe an understanding of who the Messiah was meant to be. We take it for granted, because we've grown up reading Mark and the other Gospels, that a Messiah would suffer and die. Within the context of the first century in and around Jerusalem, that was far from a given. So this word Messiah comes from a Hebrew word, Mashiach, which means an anointed one. So we think of a Messiah as Savior and being interconnected and intertwined, but this word has actually been used throughout the Old Testament over and over, dating back to Leviticus. What this word means, this Mashiach, it's the sense of being anointed, anointed with oil, anointed by God for a particular purpose. So you have priests who are anointed as Messiah or as Mashiach within the priestly codes in Leviticus. You have King Saul anointed as king within 1st and 2nd Samuel, King David. Interestingly, someone who's not Hebrew, a Persian ruler, Cyrus, who ends up helping the exiles return home after the Babylonian exile, is referred to as Mashiach within the Hebrew text. But then you also get this understanding of not just someone who is anointed for a particular purpose and time, particularly around rulers, but a ruler who is yet to come. You start seeing that pop up in Daniel and Habakkuk and others of the prophets. And there's sort of this simmering understanding that there is a great ruler yet to come, an anointed one, who will eventually be great leader in Israel. Now, we don't need to go too deep on the history, but I think this is incredibly important. This isn't obviously a historical gathering, but I think this is critical for understanding what's going on behind Mark's text. From a period of about, say 160 some years or so, Israel was a client state under the remnants of the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great swept across the Persian Empire, kind of blew it apart. His death led to a power vacuum and all sorts of infighting and yada, yada, yada. What that meant, though, for Israel was that it was ruled by two different remnants of Alexander the Great's empire, under the Ptolemaic kingdom, but then more importantly, under a kingdom known as the Seleucids, very heavy-handed, particularly as we get into the middle of that 2nd century BCE. So as you see, in 164, there was a revolt that was going on against that Greek Empire within and around Jerusalem. And this revolt, for the first time in centuries, established Jerusalem and Judah as an independent nation for the first time in centuries. It can't be overstated how important this was. And this Hasmonean kingdom, which was the name of the dynasty, ended up ruling for about 100 years. There was this idea of self-rule that had been so rare as you look back at the centuries prior. But as you start to get towards the end of the 1st century BC and into the 1st century AD, you see Rome start to flex its muscle and take control over wide swaths of the Mediterranean. And so in 64, Rome starts making entryways into the area in and around Jerusalem. Eventually, it gets put under the rulership of King Herod and the Herodian dynasty, who sort of acts as a go-between between the people there and Rome. But eventually, it gets far enough that Augustus, Caesar Augustus, officially makes Judea a Roman province in 6 AD, when Jesus would have been a child. This is part of the swirling politics that are going on in this time period, as you have this historic memory of self-rule and independence slowly sliding back into rule by a foreign government. And you see people in and around Israel start to push back against that. So at the same time that all of this is going on, you start seeing these writings looking back to texts like Jeremiah and this understanding of a future leader who would come and sort of establish a whole new era. So from Jeremiah chapter 23, "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land." So you have this understanding of sort of a kingly figure who's going to come and bring independence. You also have, in the book of Daniel, this mysterious figure known as the Son of Man. "I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed." So these things start to be read with one another, particularly as we get into this time period of self-rule, And then all of a sudden to have that start to split apart and have Rome take over, there were these increased hopes of someone who would establish this new time period of national independence. And so when Jesus, both in his childhood, but as he nears his adult ministry, probably the most dominant theories that would have been floating around about what a Messiah would look like are all fueled by this anti-Roman sentiment that you see percolating under the surface in some of the gospel texts. The most common understanding of a Messiah is someone who had been like a warrior king. In fact, you see a generation or 2 generations after Jesus' time, an armed revolt by Messiah, essentially trying to throw off Rome. It ends very poorly. But this idea of a warrior king from David's line was probably the most common understanding of who a Messiah would be in this time. You also have a sort of a lesser but still common enough understanding of someone who would be sort of a cosmic judge of the earth that you could read as being connected to this Son of Man figure. And finally, we know from kind of communities that were more out in the desert that there were also hopes that this Messiah would be more of an authoritative teacher, someone who could correctly interpret God's law for the people. And so you have all of these things swirling together at this time period of an understanding of who the Messiah is. But what do you not see on here? You don't see anything about a Messiah who would suffer, a Messiah who would die. As far as we can tell, this was a completely novel and new concept at the time. It would have been genuinely sort of paradigm breaking. And so much of what you see Mark's gospel doing is trying to reframe and reorient our understanding of who the Messiah is, connecting it to this understanding of a suffering servant. You see that the gospel is actually very well framed from a literary perspective into very neat blocks and very distinct sections. But the culminating part of Jesus' ministry in Galilee was what we had just read, this proclamation from Peter that Jesus is the Messiah. And then you hear him tell Peter not to tell anyone. And then there's this whole section for the next 3 chapters in which Jesus is talking about that he needs to suffer, he needs to die, and the disciples are struggling with it. They don't understand. And interestingly, this section is framed by 2 passages of Jesus healing those who are blind. The first one, he heals the man, and the man isn't fully healed. He sees trees, but blurrily. Fascinating little bit of bookending there, before eventually Jesus heals a blind man who lets go of this term son of David, and finally he can see. Fascinating little bit of juxtaposition and bookending by Mark in this gospel. But what you have that is sort of Jesus laying out, this is what it means to be a Messiah. Within the later part of the gospel, finally we let go of the immediatelys and the rushing. And for 5 chapters, the gospel slows down and focuses on what's known as the passion narrative. Now, you may have heard passion narrative and think that that comes from Jesus' love and that passion that he has for others. It actually is coming from a Latin word, passio, meaning suffering. This is a narrative about Jesus' arrest, being put on trial, his suffering on the cross, and then eventually, as we get into Mark 16, his resurrection. But what Mark is trying to do, and which is intriguing as we think about how this would have been received in the early church, what Mark is trying to argue is that Jesus' suffering did not mean that his mission and ministry was a failure, that this was always the intention, and that this suffering is actually what makes him the Messiah. It would have been, as I said, we almost take this understanding for granted today, but in the context of, say, a convert in the wider Roman Empire, you're going to need some convincing about why someone who was put to death by the Roman Empire is worth following. Same for those who would have been in and around Jerusalem, who may have just seen Jesus walking the street as a criminal. Why is this person who has suffered and died, why is that person the Messiah and not a leader, a kingly leader, someone who would throw off Rome? It's a complete shift that this gospel writer is trying to make. And I think that's such an important piece of what's going on in Mark's gospel. So as we think about Mark, it's again, it can be one of the interesting pieces of Mark's gospel is that so much of it would have been novel for its time. But I think you cannot overemphasize how important this shift of being made about Messiah is, and how crucial it was that other gospel writers pick up that understanding and continue adding on to it. And that's about a little of what we're going to get into in just a second with Matthew. But I'll close with Mark, a few kind of quirks here and there. One of the things that had fascinated people for a long time was this, what's known as the messianic secret, that Jesus is constantly telling those he heals, and even the disciples, to not make him known, sternly, in fact. You see, multiple times, he sternly ordered them not to make him known. Doesn't this fly in the face of what we would think about Jesus as the Messiah? But what scholars assume, what I think is completely accurate, is that what Jesus is doing is, if word gets out that he is the Messiah in and around Jerusalem in the first century, all those different understandings, people start putting those on him. They would see him as potentially a military leader, a kingly leader. Mark and Jesus would have been worried about that misunderstanding. That's why misunderstanding is such a constant theme throughout this text. And in fact, you even get a little of that as Jesus is riding into Jerusalem and people are lining the street to celebrate. There's a lot of connections between that and sort of a military procession, the fact that he goes to the temple. You can see why people would have felt threatened by Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, and especially those in positions of authority. And so I think this running theme of the messianic secret is very accurate to how Jesus was careful about his ministry, making sure, trying to get the right understanding out there rather than letting rumors run wild. And the last thing before I pause, and I'm happy to take a few questions on Mark's gospel before we turn to Matthew, is that Mark sometimes gets criticized is probably too strong of a word, but it's seen of as sort of lesser in some ways because of how much shorter it is, because of how quick everything moves. I don't think it gets the respect it deserves for how carefully crafted this gospel is. You had heard me reference earlier these sort of 5 conflicts that Jesus has between the religious leaders of the day. Fascinatingly, when you go back, there is a clear pattern, what's known in the ancient world as a chiasm. It's an oral storytelling structure in which it's almost like Russian nesting dolls of a story. You see this happen where the healing narrative, a passage about disobedience to the law, an interesting section about new wineskins, which we can talk about in a second, and then it tracks back out as well. The reason for this structure is whatever story was at the center has resonance for all the other ones. It was a classic way that people told stories in the ancient world. And at the very center of this text is one of the very few unique passages to Mark that doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels. This understanding of new wineskins and not putting new wine into old wineskins. It's a little enigmatic, to be fair. But what's at the core of this, what Mark is trying to get at, is that Jesus' ministry can't be placed into these old wineskins. He is something new. He is something completely outside the fabric of what had been known at that time. And that shift that's going on extends to the way that law is practiced, extends to healing on the Sabbath, all these sorts of things. And so this careful structuring is really impressive and quite beautiful. You also get that, I had already described sort of the bookending within this passage about Jesus' self-revelation, bookended by these stories of Jesus healing those who are blind. There's such a careful rhythm and this understanding of trying to provide sight and understanding about who Jesus is, that it seems like this section was incredibly carefully composed and woven. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Mark's gospel for, I think it unfairly gets maligned as sort of the lesser of the 4, and I think there's a lot to lift up and celebrate from it as being really carefully done and well done. So that's a quick overview with the Gospel of Mark. Before we move on to Matthew, I'll pause for any questions anyone might have about Mark. Yes. Hopefully this mic works, and I can always repeat the question.
My question is about the word synoptic. I thought that all the Gospels were synoptic, all four, but only three are.
So Annette's question was about the synoptic gospels, why it's only referring to Matthew, Mark, and Luke and not John. There are some who would argue that John's gospel is related to those others. The reason why those three get lifted up is that 3/4 of the Gospel of John is completely unique from the other gospels. Even if that gospel writer was aware, he felt very free to not follow what Matthew, Mark, and Luke were doing, and instead use a great deal of other material. Scholars have argued that was intentional. There was no reason to keep rewriting the same gospel over and over. But the reason why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptics is, again, from that high degree of the triple tradition and the ways in which those passages are shared between one another. So thank you for the question. Yes, Rebecca, I'm so far away from you. Uh-oh. All right, thank you for that. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Absolutely.
I think when you were trying to give us the history of the word Messiah, you go back, 300 or 400 years BC,
Yes.
and it wasn't a religious belief. It was more a leadership, a secular kind of leader that they were looking for. And then in the Christian era, that get mixed up, or I don't want to say conform.
Sure. So question.
Religious and secular.
Yeah. So for those online, the question was about seeing a Messiah as being more of a secular leader rather than religious. One of the complicating things in the ancient, there was not a great deal of difference between the two. The political and religious spheres were pretty heavily overlapped with one another. And so anytime there was a religious component, it inevitably had a political dynamic as well, and vice versa. So it's hard to separate the two from one another. I would argue that there certainly was both a religious and political dynamic, even going back to, Cyrus is a great example. He was referred to as Messiah because he helped the people get out of exile. Now, granted, it's interesting that it was a foreign ruler being praised as a Messiah for saving the people, but that intermix of politics and religion it's hard to separate the two in the ancient world. Yes. I'm so sorry. I know we should. Thank you. Right there.
I don't think Mark pays any attention to the nativity whatsoever. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, part of it may just be that Mark is all business. He, from the very start of the gospel, and as you see as you read it, he wastes no time in proclaiming, I think it's the first verse, is that he proclaims Jesus Christ. Like he just gets right into it. I think in the ancient world, there generally was little interest in people as children. Oftentimes when you read ancient biographies, the only thing that was of interest was when people were fully formed adults. That's not how we think of biographies today. We're curious how someone grows up and how that made them into the person they are today. That was not a common convention within the ancient world. And so to the extent that Matthew and Luke have these accounts of Jesus' birth, it's more signifying things about who he becomes as an adult rather than an interest in him as a child. But it is an interesting dynamic when you compare the two, and it has always led to questions about, was Mark aware of these and just didn't want to include them or didn't feel it was important? It's possible. But yeah, I would love to know. I would love to know what was going through his mind as he picked and chose what to include and what not. Yeah, Ted.
I'm curious, you haven't talked at all about charisma and the idea that Mark seemed in some ways not proclaiming as much the divinity of Christ as Matthew and Luke do, but seems to be proclaiming the kingdom of God is at hand.
Yes.
How do you see that tying in with this idea of the suffering?
No, it's a very interesting and layered question, so I'll try to answer it as best I can. You are correct in saying that Mark, more than the other Gospels, spends less time emphasizing Jesus' divinity. Probably the closest hints you get to it, funnily enough, we think about Son of God as this term that would mean God's Son. Interestingly enough, this Son of Man title is actually one that carries a lot more sort of cosmic, divine authority. And Jesus refers to, sometimes obliquely, occasionally directly in the Gospel of Mark, refers to himself as Son of Man. This is about the closest we come in the text to him sort of claiming any level of divinity. You know, when you compare that with the Gospel of John, that, I mean, take the prologue, for example, there's no secret about this. Some of this gets into questions about how much Jesus was careful about sharing that information versus what, you know, later disciples came to understand and were much more explicit. In the same way that Jesus was careful about disclosing that relationship or disclosing about being the Messiah, perhaps there was a cautiousness about being very upfront about divinity. That may be what's reflected in Mark, but it's a challenging question and is one of the great points of tension between Mark's gospel and John's. So yeah, it's a good question. All right, any others before we get on to Matthew? All right. So we'll turn on to the third page in your handout. So 3 and 4 will be on Matthew. And so we're going to be spending time talking about Matthew's sort of significant framing of Jesus through the lens of Judaism. So part of the contrast that's going on here, many scholars, most scholars in fact, believe that Mark would have been written to primarily a Gentile audience. We know this because occasionally Mark will stop to explain Jewish customs that wouldn't need explaining. There's a section in Mark where he explains that people wash their hands before they eat. If you're Jewish, you would not need an explanation about why that is. And so most people assume that Mark is writing for an audience that's not familiar with the practices of Judaism. Matthew, by contrast, could not spend more time with making connections between the Hebrew scriptures and with Jesus. And so, you know, a little review from last session, that all of the early church fathers fairly unanimously seem to agree that the gospel author was the same as Jesus' disciple within the text. Although one of the curious things is that if that is the case, why Matthew seems to be using Mark so extensively as a source. So that's an open question. But one of the most interesting and I think important pieces for our purposes is that there seems to be some evidence that this was written in Antioch, which is a community, I don't remember the mileage exactly, but it's a community to the north of where Jerusalem was. That after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, that it was a major site of both for Jews and for Christians where people left and settled in Antioch. And you see early church fathers in Antioch, every time they're writing, quoting from a gospel, they use Matthew's gospel. And so there seems to have been some sort of relationship here. The reason why this is important is if Matthew is writing in this Jewish Christian site and city, it would explain a lot about why Matthew is so interested in showing and representing how Jesus is fulfilling various aspects of Old Testament texts. So we should start by saying he is incredibly, incredibly well-versed in the Hebrew Bible, not even from just direct quotes, but from allusions and things that you would have to study going deep on the text. One of my favorite ones from this, and I think I even referred to this last class, I know a lot of us don't just sit down and read genealogies. I think that's fair to say. But there's this curious thing at the end of this genealogies that kick off Matthew's gospel, that he emphasizes multiple times that the generations from Abraham to David are 14, David to the deportation to Babylon, the exile, 14, from Babylon to the Messiah, 14. You might be saying, what's the deal with that? If you look in your handout, what this is I would say, unless you are Jewish, a fairly obscure connection between Hebrew lettering and numbers. So if you look in here, your alphabet as you go, just doing like a one-to-one. So Aleph, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, would be a 1. Bet would be 2. And then importantly, so for the name David, Dalet Vav Dalet, that would be equal to 4, 6, 4, or 14. Matthew is emphasizing David's connection, this Davidic line in this. If you are someone who's in the wider, Greco-Roman Empire, that's going to mean nothing to you. I think what we see pretty clearly in these continual hints is that Matthew is writing with those who are Jewish or have a deep familiarity with Hebrew in mind. Otherwise, why would you make that emphasis? You also have, and this gets some into how the gospel is structured. There are these there are 5 very orderly collections of discourses in which Jesus gives sort of long explanations. Matthew goes so far as to incorporate things from across where Mark does and pile them all together into these great discourses. Most famously, the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5 through 7. Scholars believe that part of what he's doing with these 5 discourses is that this is sort of meant to mimic the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the providing of the Torah. And you get that as well as you see Jesus in the early chapters of Matthew's gospel mirroring the beginning of Exodus, with whether it is Pharaoh's demand to kill the infants mirroring with Herod. You see Jesus's family flees to Egypt and then goes out of Egypt. There are all these resonances. Matthew is sort of portraying early on Jesus as the new Moses and then continues to expand on that. And so you have a lot of these connections made that, again, probably would not mean much unless you are Hebrew by background. And then the other thing, if you've ever read through the Gospel of Matthew, you will almost certainly come across Matthew quoting Hebrew scripture, this idea of what had been spoken through the prophets. As you can see, just within the first 2 chapters of Matthew, we have 5 direct quotes along with allusions to 5 others. Within the first 2 chapters, you have 10 clear allusions to a wide range from the biblical text, from prophets to things from the Pentateuch, the Psalms, and others. It is clear that this is deeply important to Matthew, and importantly, to Matthew's community. Now, one of the other things that's very interesting as we get into how this relates and some of the tension that's going on in Matthew's time, Mark is sometimes a little vague on the opponents that Jesus is sort of interacting with. They're occasionally described as Pharisees, but scribes or religious leaders, or he doesn't seem to be very consistent with that, and that floats around. Matthew instead has a lot of, I would say, almost visceral anger that gets directed at the Pharisees and Sadducees, and you see them pop up over and over throughout Matthew's text. So for example, if you look at in the middle of your 3rd page of the handout, you'll see Mark's account of John the Baptist and sort of this description of John. You'll see Matthew inserts this entirely additional thing about when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for his baptism. He said, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Therefore bear fruit worthy of repentance. Do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our ancestor. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham." So you have this interesting tension being raised, and especially what we know as we get towards the end of the 1st century, both in Antioch and the wider area, is that there start to be a whole lot of conflicts between Christian communities and what increasingly starts to be dominated less so by the Sadducees, more by the Pharisees, who begin to become much more dominant within late 1st century Judaism. And so you have this tension that Matthew is constantly inserting, and occasionally that rhetoric can be very visceral and intense. "You brood of vipers" is certainly among them. But you also have, interestingly, and as we talk about leadership, I had just spoken about how the disciples seem to consistently misunderstand and seem to be having a really hard time understanding who Jesus is. Matthew goes out of his way, and this is part of what makes it so interesting that Mark is the one who's said to have been taking recollections from Peter, because instead Matthew is the one who seems much more interested in Peter. You have multiple times throughout the gospel text that Peter a passage about Peter is added into Mark's account. You have this famous one of Peter taking those tentative steps out of the boat, partially sinking, so granted he didn't get it all right. But you have this understanding of Peter and him as sort of this unique figure within these early disciples, and that's a fascinating thing. That only gets amplified as we get into one of the later passages, one that builds on that question about who the Messiah is when he sternly orders not to let anyone know. So whereas Mark is very simple, Peter makes this proclamation, and then Jesus warns him not to tell anyone. Within Matthew's text, we see this huge addition. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. This is the only gospel that this text appears in. It doesn't appear in Luke's or in John's. Matthew seems to have had an extreme emphasis on Peter as sort of a pillar and leader in the early church. Now, does that connect to a particular tradition that was held within Antioch? I think there's a great likelihood that there was, that Peter would have been revered as a leader within that community. And Matthew, whether he has access to texts that Mark didn't, or otherwise, whether that was sort of oral tradition that was passed on, you have this emphasis in Matthew honoring Peter, seeing him as an important leader in the early church that you really don't get in Mark's text in particular. So that's an interesting shift going on. But then if we talk about part of what's important about Mark is reframing this understanding of the Messiah as being someone who would suffer and die before being raised. One of the other things that I think if you wanted to try to summarize what Matthew is trying to do within his gospel, I think one of the most important things, not to reduce it to only one, because that's not fair to Matthew, but one of the most unique and important things is understanding Jesus as reframing the law. If there are these tensions with Pharisees and Sadducees, all these connections back to the Hebrew Bible and showing those lines there, so much of what Jesus is doing within Matthew's gospel is reframing the tradition of Torah that's been handed down. You get a ton of this on the Sermon of the Mount, where Jesus often introduces, I believe, with you have heard it said that, and then goes on to sort of reinterpret this lens. So much of what's going on in Matthew's gospel is reinterpreting and retranslating what the law means in Jesus' day. And one of the biggest sort of shifts that is being made within this gospel is reframing it around what we now know is sort of the great commandment, the greatest commandment, that you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind, and that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, both of which obviously connect to the law from the Pentateuch, but that Jesus is more explicit about stating that this is what everything hinges on. And in fact, if you go at the very last little bit of your handout here, you'll see one of the interesting tweaks that Matthew is making within this. So as you compare these side by side, if you look at the bottom, unlike Mark and Luke, Matthew frames this as, on these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets. Mark does not offer that line. Luke does not offer that line. This is pivotal. This is what Matthew is trying to do, is to twist, and not twist. He's trying to show that this was the change in mindset in the same way that Mark is trying to shift our understanding of a Messiah as someone who must suffer and die. What Matthew is trying to communicate in his gospel is that Jesus is taking this Torah tradition, and this is what followers of him are meant to follow. This is the way that you are reframing your understanding about what's most important around these two things. And people love and hate Bart Ehrman for various reasons that I don't need to get into. But I have always loved this sort of summary paragraph that he offers about what Matthew is doing. And I think this to me sort of crystallizes it all. It says, in sum, it appears as though Matthew assumes most Christians in his community will follow traditional forms of Jewish piety and practices, but ultimately for him, these are of secondary importance. The law is to be obeyed to the fullest extent possible, but in obeying the law, what really matters is human need. And for this reason, love is the greatest commandment, and everything else is subservient to it. That this shift in understanding is part of what Matthew is trying to communicate, both in his community in the first century, as well as for us today, as we look to that relationship between what we know as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and what we know as the New Testament. And so that shift, I think, is really vital to understanding. So a quick little summary before we look ahead a little bit. So the Gospel of Mark is really doing a lot, particularly with a Gentile audience in mind, of explaining why you should follow this figure who suffered and died rather than leading a military revolt. And ultimately, the purpose of this, I believe, is that it's a story of hope, even in the face of suffering. If we take for granted that occasion for writing the Gospel as being right around the time of Jerusalem's destruction, what Mark is saying, and what Mark is sort of drawing attention to, is that that was a time of great suffering within and around of Israel. And, and that would have been aware out in the wider Greco-Roman Empire as well. For communities that are struggling, Mark is saying Jesus experienced that too and ultimately triumphed. It's a story of hope. And I think that thread of hope is an important part of what Mark's gospel is doing. And then alternatively, building on that, you have Matthew writing to, rather than a Gentile community, a Jewish audience, or at least a primarily Jewish audience in mind, making connections between Jesus and the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus is this new Moses, but that he brings an authoritative understanding of what the law is in direct opposition to the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees of his day. And instead, what Matthew is doing, in the same way that Mark has this story of hope, at the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, you have a unique passage to Matthew, doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels, the Great Commission, where Jesus sends the disciples out to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What we see, and in the same way that Peter has been emphasized as a leader, is that the gospel is drawing. They have absorbed this message from Jesus. They are the ones now carrying it out beyond the bounds of Jerusalem, out into the wider world. And so that's kind of this pivot and shift that the gospel is making that's incredibly important. So as we look ahead to next week, we are going to spend time then with Luke taking an interesting approach to that last question of the Great Commission and sort of this sending out to the ends of the earth. Matthew uses that as sort of the culmination within the gospel. But interestingly in Luke, almost from the very beginning, you have Luke emphasizing Jesus as the Messiah, not just for those in and around Jerusalem, but for all humanity. And we're going to get into sort of the universal side of Luke quite a bit next week. And then as Ted had referenced, we're also going to talk about the Gospel of John and this understanding of the Messiah not just as suffering, but comes to be seen as divine. And we know from texts that whether it's Paul or others, that Paul would have been writing, say, the 50s and maybe even the early 60s. We see this understanding of Christ as divine pop up in them, predating the Gospels. And so John takes this understanding that's present and puts it into poetry and beautiful language that has been renowned for ages, but again, stands in great contrast to these other three Gospels. And we're going to spend a little time unpacking why that might be, what the effects are, and are there connections to be made with the other Gospels? So that's what we're hoping to get into next week and sort of tie a bow on this series. But with the 4 minutes we have left, I would certainly be open to any questions that anyone might have about Matthew or about the Gospels. Yes, Jude, I know we got Jana coming forward with the mic.
Did baptism start with John the Baptist? And what's the significance of baptism to the Jewish religion? And forgive my ignorance.
No, it's not ignorant at all, and it's a fantastic question. It is. I will not claim to have an ironclad answer. My memory of it is that John the Baptist and this tradition of baptizing as a repentance of sins seems to have been fairly unique, but may have some ties to, I believe it's Tevila, a Jewish like washing ritual. And so there may be a connection that you can draw between that, but the act of being baptized in a river, whether it's full immersion or otherwise, that seems to have come to prominence under John the Baptist and this understanding of repentance from sin. I reserve the right to do a little reading and change my answer next week, but that's what I remember from my time learning about it. So I think there may be some tentative links, but as a particular tradition, I think it's a little bit unique. So yeah, good question. All right, Margaret, since you have the mic there, and then we'll go to that.
I have a question about the audiences being different for the Gospels. Yeah. I'm wondering, my work experience is mostly as a journalist, so I'm wondering whether Mark being earliest was under some kind of deadline pressure to say get this out. And
I mean, you never know. Yeah. No, I mean, it's one of the great unknown questions that obviously has a ton of importance. You know, it's one thing to speculate the type of community this was, that it was a Gentile community. We can't construct much more on that, though. I mean, you have the tie to Rome, and so, okay, like maybe you can, these are Gentile converts within Rome to Christianity, but we don't know anywhere near enough about the internal politics or whatever else was going on in those communities. In the same way that when you look at Paul's letters, it's a one-sided conversation. You don't know exactly what's going on the other end of it. And so, you know, maybe Mark's immediately, maybe was under a time pressure. I don't know. It's hard to say. But yeah, it's certainly, it's one of those things I wish we had more information about. And I just don't know that we ever will. So well, maybe someday. Yeah.
Is about the Jews, and if this is too complicated, just wave me off, but it didn't take for them. Remember, Matthew also talked to the Jewish people. It didn't take for them that the Messiah was there. And I think now, God, if I got this wrong.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
But they are still waiting.
So I want to be very cautious with this because some of it is time bound with a particular era of Judaism in which sort of that Messianic Judaism from a couple centuries before Jesus to about 100 to 150 years after Jesus was sort of the primary period in which a coming Messiah was a real point of emphasis. I would say if you ask most modern Jewish communities, I don't know that the Messiah is a very important thing within those communities. The vast majority. Maybe there are some that feel differently. But I would say it's, if you look at the context of first century Israel and even into the second century and sort of this second wave of revolt under another person who claimed to be the Messiah, Bar Kokhba, who ends up leading to a massive demolition of the area around Jerusalem. Jesus was not the only person who would have been proclaimed as Messiah in this time period. There were dozens. To some degree, the miracle is not, it's that Jesus' ministry ended up spreading amongst all these other competing and various messiahs that would have been known in that time period. In that sense, it's almost unique. So I always want to exercise caution in saying that it didn't take. I don't feel that's a fair framing of it. There were certainly people who wanted, probably not wrongly, overthrow from Rome, and then that political dimension within Jesus's inner circle. There's a disciple who's referred to as Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were a radical overthrowing Roman party. There's a question of was this disciple in Jesus's inner circle Was he hoping that Jesus would be sort of that radical revolutionary and ended up a little disappointed that Jesus suffered and died? Maybe he felt like Peter and rebuking him. You know, it's so hard to know, but it's a great question. I just always want to be cautious about that. So thank you. Yes. Sorry.
And I know at Masada that was proved that they could fight and hold out for a while. But if this is, if Mark is talking to an audience, not a military revolt, that seems reasonable to me. Where are you going to get swords, and how are you, I mean, where are you going to get military equipment? I mean,
yeah,
was it realistic to think it would be a military Messiah? I mean,
realistic, I don't know. I mean, it's so, again, you have this history of in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small community in 164, the Maccabean revolt threw off the Greek Empire, and essentially those rulers just decided it wasn't worth it. I think the calculus wasn't that they would destroy Rome, it was that Rome would just throw up their hands and be like, all right, this is not worth our time. I think there was probably a hope that by whether it was sort of this terror of the Zealots or the Sicarii, these other sort of like radical factions, I think essentially what the hope was that Rome just would see it as not worth investing military or rule into and would just pull out. Unfortunately, the opposite happens. With the person I mentioned, Bar Kokhba, who's in the 2nd century, came proclaiming to be a Messiah. Rome brought a massive army and just devastated, even worse than the destruction of the temple, just absolutely leveled Jerusalem. And that led to a diaspora and a whole host of other things. But yeah, it was probably a bit optimistic, but you could see why. And you know, this is a tale as old as time in some ways of communities that are feeling some level of oppression. Maybe the odds aren't great, but the alternative isn't any better. And so you can understand why there was that hope at minimum. So. All right, anyone else? Is that right? All right, Rachel. Yes.
The Bible. But I just suddenly started wondering, like, I know there were various Messiah figures who didn't take during this time. Are there written gospel-like, records of any of them? In other words, this same kind of testimonials that exist about Jesus. Are there the equivalent about some other dude who nobody follows anymore?
So a question about other messiahs. Are there other gospels similar to this? Not quite in the same way that we have them. A lot of it comes from historical records and sort of reporting on. It doesn't, at least from what I've read, doesn't have the sort of like evangelistic bent that these gospels do. It's more reporting on what had happened. So the other gospels, and we barely got into this last time. I wish we had more time for it, and it's really a whole other class unto itself. The gospels that we're aware of these days primarily fall into the category of what's known as the Gnostic gospels, which has to do with a particular, I describe it as a knowledge cult, Gnostic Christianity that was really, seems to have been from the 2nd century and 3rd century, some degree of popularity, and you get that primarily from early church fathers writing against it. What's interesting is it's a lot of one-way conversations as you hear church fathers essentially refuting these source texts that we did not have for centuries. And then in, I believe it was 1949, there was an amazing discovery in a community called, Nag Hammadi. There was a discovery of texts, some of whom we had known these gospels were being written against, that we actually had evidence of finally, like firsthand with these sources. The complicating factor of all of that is that very few of them, if any, seem to date from the 1st century. They all seem to have been written much later, and when you read them, there's things that seem profoundly bizarre within them, from the cross speaking and talking to others. There are a lot. Anyways, it's a class unto itself. So all that to say, aware of other Messiah-like figures, we don't have any first century gospels like the 4 we have, where there's an evangelistic bent to them. But there are these others that may come from subsequent centuries and reflect a particular community's understanding of who Jesus is, that the church fathers ultimately were writing against and rejecting. That's a really long, meandering answer, but I hope it helped. All right. Yes, John. Sure. So spelling of Gnostic, Gnostic. And if you're interested in reading more, Elaine Pagels is a really good scholar for that area. Handful of others as well. I would describe them as interesting, but I wouldn't go too deep within them. They're fun to read, but I don't know that you'll take away a whole lot of things for your faith. I guess they're more a historic. They're a historic curiosity, and they're interesting, but completely unknown. Did women write some of them? Yeah. So one of them in particular. Sorry, I know class has been over for a while. One of them in particular gets very deep into what has become a full-blown conspiracy with Mary Magdalene being married to Jesus. The roots of that are in one of those Gnostic Gospels. I'll dispel the rumor. It seems to be completely nonsense, but there was this whole tradition of it. There's a gospel called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. It seems to have been written unbelievably late. I mean, there's no way it would have been written by Mary Magdalene. But those Gnostic communities do seem to have valued women's voices more than the early church fathers did. So not great, but all right. Thank you all. I can see everyone. So thank you all. Thank you all.